So today we'll be presenting on a very radical approach, as it might sound, why we've got it wrong with the SDGs. Contrary to popular belief, we may or may not be helping as much as we think we are. So we're going to break that down for you and see exactly what's working and what's not. So we've divided this presentation up into 3 sections. The first one will be talking about the SDG stakeholders and seeing how they interact with the global goals. And then we'll be going and examining the SDG trade-offs, and we'll be seeing what's going on there and are we actually doing more harm than we think. And lastly, we'll be examining the loopholes in the SDG policies and just the framework itself and seeing how effective or how well it is implemented. So I'll just start off, So first we'll go into the stakeholders, and stakeholders essentially is everyone in this case. You have everyone who is involved in it. So just to touch up on why the SDGs were created, they were firstly made as a blueprint and a roadmap to achieve more sustainable future for everyone, which is why we see a lot of equality related sustainable goals too. They want to tackle issues from poverty to climate change, education, employment. So it's really a very broad and diverse range of goals that they've set up. And they really stemmed from the Millennium Development Goals, as you might know. The MDGs were a systematic attempt to set up an action-oriented guideline, just like the SDGs, but they were sort of like, so 2000 to 2015 was the MDGs, and 2015 to 2030, the vision is for SDGs. So these were the MDGs. There's 8 compared to the 17 SDGs that we see now. And they were very, very targeted and specific. So you see improving maternal health. You see combating HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. So these were issues that were prominent and systematically rising in the world at the time. And we've seen a change from, I guess, the 2000s to now. And which is why there was a need for creating the Sustainable Development Goals. Oops. Yeah, so they are more detailed and they are more broken down into the issues that we see today and what exactly we need to fix. And just to point something out very important that we will cover later on in the presentation as well, the SDGs are completely voluntary. There is no legally binding resolution or any sort of document that says, oh, you have to do this, you have to achieve it. So this is something that's very important. And then going into the stakeholders, who is involved and how. So we have 3 different branches. You have the government, who essentially has large impact but bad ideas. So they have large impact because they have a really wide base, and which is why they have a lot of resources available to them. But they don't really have the best ideas because of a very top-down approach. So as a person living in a street, you know what goes well, what goes wrong. But as a government or a bureaucracy, you don't necessarily know and understand what that person might need. So because of that, and because of all the things that come with the bureaucratic practice, like corruption and all kinds of bad stuff, it gets pretty difficult for a government to enact the change that we want to see. Then you have non-government organizations. They have small impact because, again, lack of resources, funding, and all these things, but they have great ideas because they're really in touch with the grassroots of the issue. They want to see the change that people are dealing, with issues that people are dealing with, and they really know exactly where to tap in. And if you see NGOs, each of them specializes in different things, which really gives them an incentive and like a very good background to help. And then you have non-state actors, which is us, universities, businesses, and all these people who are essentially doing the same thing with a lot less resources, but a lot better ideas. So that's a little bit of a breakdown.
Right, so now that we've talked about who's who, we can start talking about what this idea of trade-offs and synergies mean. So trade-offs is something that we kind of face every day in our lives. So whether you're talking about work-life balance or something that we study economics, the idea of opportunity cost, you can't get everything that you always want because inherently there's always limitations to that. So it's this compromise, so to speak, between two desirable yet incompatible features. And this idea of trade-offs can be implemented or transferred to the SDGs as well in two separate ways. The first one is within the goals, which I'll be talking about, and trade-offs between the goals, which Sanskriti will talk about later. So within the goals, or trade-offs within the goals, if you visualize it, it looks something like this. Yeah, this complicated and colorful graph on the right, and I'll explain what this is. So all our data in our website is coming from a published article in Nature called Are We Successful in Turning Trade-Offs into Synergies? And I put the QR code here for you to read the article if you'd like to know more about the method. So what this means, if we focus on maybe SDG 2, which is highlighted in the blue box on the top right side, the red part is the degree of trade-offs within the targets of SDG 2. The green part is the synergies in SDG 2, and the yellow part is not classified. So what these authors did is that they took all the different targets underneath goal 2, and they said, okay, if we compare this and this, are these two targets synergistic or are there trade-offs there? And they do this for all 17 targets, all 17 goals where there's data. And the small numbers on the right side, for example, 347, which is highlighted in the blue box, that just means the number of data pairs the authors have used to make this final kind of degree of, the relative degree of trade-offs within each SDG. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you what this kind of means in practice. So for SDG 2, we saw in the previous slide that there was a lot of red, so there was a lot of trade-offs. So I got to thinking, okay, what are the trade-offs in SDG 2 when you're talking about that? And SDG 2 stands for zero hunger. So I just took two targets under goal 2 to see what this means. So the first one, 2.3, asks that by 2030, we double the agriculture productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. And then directly the next one, 2.4, asks that by 2030, we should ensure that food is produced in a sustainable way. So why is this a trade-off, you might ask? Well, it's true that we have doubled or even accelerated that agricultural productivity already, but the trade-off comes in the fact that we're not producing food in a sustainable way. And you might ask, like, why? How can we make this in a more sustainable way? But that is the inherent problem that we're trying to kind of focus on in our current, global economy, the way that governments work, the way that allocation on a large scale works, is that we don't have, frankly, sustainable food production systems to ensure that the trade-off, the specific trade-off that we're talking about, is eradicated. So for now, this trade-off between goal or target 2.3 and target 2.4 will remain as long as our food production systems are not sustainable, so to speak. And then the next one, Sanskriti will talk about. Oh yeah, so this kind of goes to show what we said right at the start, where we're not trying to talk bad about the SDG framework. We're just highlighting that the solutions that we have in our arsenal to implement to get to the framework is bad. So the SDG framework with the 17 goals is wonderful, but currently the way that our economy functions, we don't have these wonderful solutions to meet these ambitious 17 goals.
Okay, so now we get to the exact same concept, but we examine SDGs against other SDGs. So this graph, so these are all relationships between SDG 1, and this will go, so this is examining SDG 1 and 2. This is 1 and 3, this is 1 and 4. So that's how it's broken down. And it's the exact same concept, red, green, and yellow, and it compares the two goals. And this shows you how big of a trade-off or synergy there is. And as you can see, there might be some very surprising numbers, especially between 11 and 13 that we'll get to after this. And just an important thing to point out that the degree of trade-offs and synergies, it varies because this is a very global graph that has been presented. It doesn't take into account the fact that are we comparing low income or high income countries? What are the resources? What is the capacity available to the country? So obviously when you take in those factors, the graphs will look a bit different, but on a global, more holistic level, this is what it will look like. So if we compare 13 and 11, which is climate action in sustainable cities and communities, you can see that there is a big trade-off between them, because in SDG 13, it says foster climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food. But immediately below that, you see target 11, which says to ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing. So in order to set up that housing, in order to set up that sustainable city, you're going to be using a lot of resources, which will have a very negative impact on climate action, greenhouse emissions, land space being used, which will cut down on sustainable food resources. So you have all these problems that are just interlinking, and you're achieving 11. No one's arguing that. But at the same time, you're pushing 13 down so far. So these are the things, these are the problems that we believe are there with the SDGs. The framework works wonderfully, but the solutions that we're implementing are not in the capacity that will allow us to actually achieve the 2030 vision. So that is what we kind of want to change. So if we go on to the next one, Sandev.
Now that we've introduced what trade-offs and synergies are, I think I saw a question in the chat as well. How do we eradicate these trade-offs? Sans?
Oh, next one, sorry.
No worries. So just to go back to the start, we spoke about governments and NGOs. The reason that NGOs are so good, for at least now, is what we're kind of arguing. The reason that NGOs are good at eradicating trade-offs is because they see the local community as having the best problems, the best solutions to their problems, right? So NGOs go out to the field, they listen to what the problems are in that community, and then they create, implement, and redesign this program with the community. Whereas, as Sanskriti said at the start, governments, on the other hand, implement large-scale blanket policies that do not meet these very specific local or regional issues. And even if you do consider local authorities at all levels of government, for example, there are a lot of countries where poor governance leads to a mismanagement of funds for such projects, or projects that are simply not successful. And just to give you an example of the type of issue that governments are bad at, but NGOs are wonderful at. And it's an issue of planetary health, which with a pandemic right now is very apt to talk about. So the philosophy behind planetary health is that in order to ensure a healthy environment or healthy environment, you have to have healthy people. And the opposite is true as well. To have healthy people, you need a healthy environment. And this is what it looks like visualized on the left side, where you have different sets of SDGs interacting with one another. So you have the biosphere, society, and the economy. And what this means in reality, when you take it down and try to implement it as a project, is someone who's trying to create a new project in a rainforest would ask the question, why was this forest cut down in the first place? Instead of asking the question, how do we replant this forest? Because what the UN and what businesses with their CSR projects and what governments do is let's say, okay, you spend $20 today and we're gonna plant this tree here tomorrow. But they never take into account the fact that the local community might look at the forest as a source of income for them, or they might look to the forest as other sources of resources for them that requires them to cut these trees down. And an NGO that I've worked with before called ASTRI in Indonesia has tackled this exact problem. So in Indonesia and in Sukadana specifically, they went to the community and they asked them, all right, how do we stop deforestation in this national park? And at the end of this discussion with the local community, they decided to set up a clinic that provides quality, affordable healthcare to the local population. And the way that the people pay for this healthcare is by offering seedlings or by offering other resources. So like they're trading for barter, they're not giving cash because that was the issue in the first place. And this works because the loggers don't have to go to the forest and cut down trees to pay for healthcare. They can just come here and give seedlings to this NGO. And there's also another aspect of their work that promotes alternative livelihoods. So instead of loggers going to the forest to cut down more trees, this NGO actually paid loggers to give them their chainsaw. And this enabled loggers to go and start sustainable businesses and support their family in alternative ways that didn't require the forest being cut down. And the reason that governments can never do this is because it's such a specific targeted program that it's too complicated without a immediate feedback mechanism for governments to implement. And if we kind of visualize this in 3 quick steps, the first step would be that we take the great ideas of NGOs that eradicate trade-offs, and we pair this with the large mandate or resources of governments to achieve the 2030 agenda, because governments, as we kind of pointed out, aren't the best at coming up with these ideas, but NGOs already have the solutions on the ground. It's just the matter of scaling up what's already happening today. Yeah. And next slide, Sanskriti. For this to happen, we need governments and NGOs in the same room. And that's kind of what is the sticking point in why we still have trade-offs, because even though you might think, oh, governments and NGOs work a lot, there's a lot of ways in which they're also kind of missing the mark. And this is something that looks confusing in the start, but we'll work through it. This just shows how governments and NGOs really are not in the same room discussing one idea. Rather, they're just off in their separate rooms talking about whatever it is. So let's kind of start from the start. We first have the UN General Assembly adopting the SDGs, and then the SDGs kind of bleed through the UN and national level, where it gets to this point where the government implements their policies and monitors progress, right? So once the government implements this policy to the targeted community, the government never receives feedback. Whereas if you look a bit up from where I am to NSAs and NGOs, NGOs receive immediate feedback from the community and redesign their program, which is something that we mentioned earlier as well. But the key to getting governments and NGOs in the same room discussing is something called taking stock of progress towards the goals. And this happens in many ways. So for example, you have the UNFCCC, which is the large climate change conference that happens once a year. You have the HLPF, which happens every year at the UN, where countries come together and talk about the work that they're doing. But if you really go to these conferences and you see the type of debates and negotiations they're having, you will quickly realize that governments are in one room talking about how do we achieve this, how do we achieve that, whereas NGOs and non-state actors, NSAs, are in another room talking about the fantastic work they've done in eradicating this trade-off or the wonderful work they've done in regards to planetary health, right? And there's never any, discussion between them. So I think, as someone asked the question, how do we as young people kind of break the cycle and eradicate trade-offs? Personally, I would start here. I would start at conferences that happen more than once a year, that takes stock of progress, and get governments and NGOs to sit down together and start talking about how we can finally start, changing the system, how we can get good ideas and scale that up. So just to finally visualize what we've talked about so far, if you consider a world where we've eradicated all trade-offs, a world where we've eradicated all trade-offs, and by 2030, this would enable us to achieve all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So that's this green bar that we have right at the top, where we've 100% accomplished the 2030 agenda. So we might be able to arbitrarily place our current action, somewhere around the midpoint or somewhere a bit higher than that, because all we have to do, theoretically, according to what we've said right now, is to eradicate trade-offs. But as Sanskriti will show you right now, we are a bit further behind than that.
Yeah. Okay. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is the SDG loopholes and policies. So as you might have guessed, within a lot of bureaucratic processes and institutions, there is a lot of room to wiggle. There's a lot of room to get out of things. So it's the same with the UN. In the UN, you have a lot of issues within the systematic approach to their institution. And one of the things that we're going to look into is the loopholes in SDG 13, specifically in climate actions. So the reason why we're looking into the policies that countries are being able to implement takes us back to the first thing that I mentioned, is that the SDGs are completely voluntary. There is nothing binding you to saying, oh yeah, I'm gonna achieve this, I'm gonna do this, and then I'm gonna hold myself accountable so that I get there. So for this reason, a lot of countries have been using this as a way of saying, oh, I'm gonna achieve like 20% less emissions than the last decade, which might be absolutely nothing, you know, for some countries. So just to give you more of a perspective in this. So this is a graph that shows Russia's commitment to the 2030 vision. So what Russia said is that they are going to achieve, I guess, 30% less emissions than their base year. And their base year they used as 1990, which is the year that the Soviet Union collapsed. So when you saw the Soviet Union collapse, you also saw a lot of industries leave the country. And because of that, immediately there were less emissions. There were less greenhouse emissions. There was less action taken against the environment. So naturally, their emissions went down. So you can see around here in like late 1990s, their emissions were below 2000. So after that, they realized, oh, we're actually below what we wanted to achieve. So we have this wiggle room where we can increase our emissions and we'll be fine because we told them that we're going to only get down 30%. So that's what they're doing. So you can see from the late 1990s to now, their emissions have actually risen. And we got this data from a website called the Climate Action Tracker, which is like, I would highly recommend that you check this out. And they actually rate countries sort of their aims and their goals. So this website labeled Russia as critically insufficient because their model does not actually say, oh, we're bringing it down. They brought it down, but now they're bringing it up. So it's kind of counterintuitive. And we can see a similar case with Australia. So recently, Australia has been a hot spot on the news. It has been getting a lot of sort of like critical claims on their climate action policies, and what they're doing is not sufficient, or they're not doing the right thing and stuff like that. So to show you their graph, you see that what they did essentially is that they decided that they are going to carry out their Kyoto Agreement credits over to the Paris Agreement credits. So they achieved a lot for the Kyoto Agreement, and they said, oh, we did so much, so we're just going to carry this over towards the SDGs, and we're going to, like, we're just going to carry out a normal economic structure, but we're going to, like, we're just going to finesse the system, you know? So this is not working because you're not bringing anything down. You're technically going up. So you can see from the 2000s, they have gone up significantly. So in this way, countries are finding loopholes. They are finding little wiggle rooms to get out of this. And countries are not really setting a very realistic goal for themselves to achieve the 2030 agenda. So in this way, governments, while they may have resources, they're only acting in a very short-term manner. They're not really looking long-term, and they're not looking at a global picture. They're only looking at their own actions and what they will have and their repercussions within their own countries. Right now, what we need is a more global approach. So because of this, if we add this to the progress chart, we can see that we are currently here at our current action. And if we somehow manage to magically remove the SDG loopholes, we will have a significantly higher progress rate to achieve the 2030 vision. But if we take off trade-offs and the loopholes, we're set. So that is what we wanted to show you, that while the SDGs as a framework is so good, it's so vast and it's so diverse, there are inherent problems within the way that we implement them and within the way that we're actually approaching them, which is wrong. Because you may think that, oh, I'm doing this for climate action, but you might be cutting out from sustainable cities. You might be taking away from planetary health by doing something else. So these are the things that we want to show you, that no matter what action you take, there will be a trade-off. But how do you minimize that trade-off? How do you bring it down? That is what we want you to think about. So I know that a lot of youth and a lot of students across the world have all these amazing ideas. So now we want you to think, are these feasible? Is this viable? Is this actually going to help in the long run? So I guess that is what we wanted to show you. Sandev, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I mean, good job, Sanskriti. Just to go on the whole Russia-Australia thing, what that graph showed you was something called NDC, or a nationally determined contribution. And because, as Sanskriti mentioned, the SDGs are voluntary, the UN developed a system where every 5 years, countries have to tell the world what they're going to do in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. So every 5 years, so 2015 and now 2020, countries voluntarily say, okay, by 2030, I'm going to reduce it by this much. But, you know, as Sanskriti mentioned, for both cases, Russia and Australia, they've used the system in a way that allows them to increase significantly their greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And again, you can see that from the black line kind of going up and continuing till 2030. And, you know, if all countries were to act like Russia and Australia, we would see a world with over 4 degrees of warming, which obviously is terrible for us. So, and I think I saw some questions as well. How do we young people kind of fight that? You know, it's really up to us to, you know, if you can, call your representative, go to these meetings and kind of take charge of your own future, so to speak, and keep these people in power accountable, because, you know, at the end of the day, that's what we can do right now, because this issue is so systemic. And yeah, I think Sanskriti has another kind of interactive thing that she'd like to share with all of you, just to get your ideas. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we kind of said what we wanted to say. This is, again, very student perspective based on what we've seen online, research, and from our classes and our background. So if you think that we got something wrong, please let us know. We're more than happy to sort of take your inputs in and everything. So what I've done here is I've actually created this thing called Mural, and it's sort of like it's a very like interactive canvas. So what you're gonna do is basically put on sticky notes. So I'll just put this in the chat and everyone can join. You don't have to put your names. This can be completely anonymous if you'd like. And if you just log on and see, I've created this thing, and if you double click, let me just wait. All right. So if you double click on the screen, a post-it note will appear. And on that post-it note, you can write things. So please feel free to zoom in. It zooms in quite a lot, so you can take up as little space as you need to. And just fill it in with your ideas. This is supposed to be a sort of reflection activity to see how you in the past, or maybe in the coming future, may have been seen or been accustomed to trade-offs and you might not know it, or how you think that countries should be held accountable, or just different ideas. And in the meantime, we're also open to questions. So if you have any, shoot them our way.
Would you like the admins to facilitate the Q&A session for you, or would you like to select questions from chats by yourselves?
I think we're good either way. You could facilitate. I think that'll work better.
Okay, then the first question will come from Rebecca, who is from UK, about prioritizing SDGs. Rebecca, you can turn on your microphone for to ask your question.
Hi, yeah, basically my question was just, if we had to prioritize certain SDGs, because sometimes they undermine each other, how do you decide which to prioritize? Like, would it be on the most currently pressing issues, or how do we prioritize the SDGs?
I think, Sandev, you want to go ahead?
I mean, that's also, I mean, I understand where you're talking about, but I think that's also part of it. You know, we can't pick and choose one for time being. The idea is that we try to push the bar along for all 17 in whatever we do. But, you know, the SDGs were never ranked in order of importance, and I don't want to be the one to do that. But I think that's part of the conversation we ought to be having is, you know, we can't just focus on this one thing because it looks good or because it's easy to do. Rather, we should have these difficult conversations and try to, you know, really as Goal 17 outlines, build networks and achieve all these different goals together and build kind of non-traditional partnership with others to try to get this thing in the works. But yeah, you know, it's a tough thing to do at the same time, to try to be very ambitious to say, oh, we need to do all of this right now. But I think that's part of the larger conversation we ought to be having is how do we actually start doing that? So in short, great question, but the answer is still in the works.
I think the other thing I'd say to that is that the SDGs were never meant to be prioritized. Trade-offs should not exist. And if trade-offs don't exist, you don't have to prioritize. So that's what we're trying to get you to see, that how do we minimize trade-offs so that we don't essentially have to answer that question? Do I go for what, 11 or 13? Which one do I go for first?
Thank you for your answers. So the next question will come from Lessa, who's from Qatar.
Sorry, just give me a second. I'm just trying to find my question. So my question was specifically to when you spoke about the trade-offs between SDG 11 and 13, because when we work in school, and I've done a project on environmental engineering, when we speak in school and we talk about sustainable cities and environmental design and things like that, we usually design them to combat the climate crisis. So specifically trying to implement agricultural components in this design. So where did we go wrong along the way? Because from my perspective as a high school student, this is what I see, that SDG 11 is supposed to work towards SDG 13. So where did we go wrong?
Hi, thanks for your question. I think when you're talking about 11, 13, creating sustainable cities while maintaining our climate commitments, where we went wrong is kind of a very long or like a very in-depth thing, but it's really in the way that the global economy works, like to put it very bluntly, because, you know, in creating the different technology or in creating our cities, there's a lot of inefficient methods we use in terms of construction, in terms of building new infrastructure that cannot in any way, you know, advance both of these goals, 13 and 11. I think to combat that, we do need, you know, and I'm seeing it on the mural as well, it's more about circular economy, more about zero carbon emissions, or even carbon sequestration, where we're taking more carbon dioxide out from the atmosphere than we're pumping out. So I think that's what the eradicating the trade-off between these two goals would look like. But yeah, I mean, it's also very difficult to say, oh, we're not gonna, emit any GHGs, because that's just how our technology today operates. And even, producing solar panels, producing wind turbines, all of this are high energy or energy intensive processes that, it's impossible to achieve what it's talking about. But I think there's a lot more that cities can do in terms of making sure that climate commitments are integrated within a city. But for now, I think that's the best that I can answer your question. Yeah.
Thank you. If I could just ask another very short question. So on the presentation, you mentioned that government policies are more general and they skip out on local contexts. So is there a way for policymakers to create a customizable policy per se based on local contexts? Or in that case, would we be trading off time for efficiency?
I think, again, that goes down to how well or how good the feedback mechanism is that the country has built in on a regional or even a local level. Because without that kind of mechanism, there's no point for the local kind of government to go out there and try to implement this program. But in terms of the trade-off between efficiency, I think that it's something that once built will be able to carry on kind of its own, like there will be momentum that builds up. But for now, I think a stepping stone to get to what you're talking about is to take, the existing ideas of NGOs, because governments would not have to waste time in the process of trying to create these cross-cutting solutions, whereas they can kind of pick the existing solutions that NGOs have and scale it up that way. So in terms of lost time, that's one way to minimize it, by taking the information and ideas that already exist.
Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. The next question will come from our press member, Ayomide.
Hello, I actually had a question relating to SDG 8 and businesses. So how do you create incentive for businesses and companies to commit to the SDGs as they hold economic power and they're not tied down by the same government restrictions that governments actually have to focus on?
I mean, I guess it's also because if you don't commit to it, the world is essentially, it's going to scramble. Like, if you don't commit to climate action, you're just not going to survive eventually, So the trajectory that we're going at, it doesn't really say, oh, we're going to live for another million years or something. So if that's not incentive enough, I really don't know what is. Other than that, Sandev, I don't know if you had anything in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Lance. Just to kind of talk about the debate in the kind of environmental studies world about the use of, or like capitalizing nature, where, some argue that the only way to get businesses and others on board is to show them that there's money to be made by protecting the environment. But others, as Sanskriti said, others argue that businesses should want to protect the environment for its own sake. There should be no kind of money or monetary compensation involved in terms of protecting a forest or protecting a protected area. So to that regard, how do we get businesses on board? One thing that where I'm trying with my college and other affiliates is that we're trying to show, or again, take stock of progress of what the work of my college is doing in terms of the goals. So let's take a business, for example. One way that you could get them to buy in, so to speak, on the idea of the SDGs is to show them that the work that they're doing already is directly in line with goal 8 or goal 5 or so on, and that there are certain things that they could do better or change that would make them more aligned with a certain goal. And by doing so, they will have access to, I don't know, a UN conference or something like that, instead of having this whole monetary compensation argument right in front. Because yeah, you know, right now within the UN climate change conferences, there's a lot of talk about carbon credits. I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with that, but it's the idea that, you know, countries and businesses have the opportunity to make money by selling or trading carbon credits. And that's something that not everyone is for, but, you know, if you're looking for a financial kind of solution to this problem, I guess that's what businesses would be backing the most, the idea of carbon credits and buying and trading credits.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, I believe so. So the last question will come from Renat about taking action.
Thank you, Daphne. First, I'd like to thank you for that really insightful presentation. And my question comes down to, you introduced the faults with some of the solutions of the SDGs, such as the trade-offs. Now, how can we as the youth help mitigate these faults, both at a local level and also a widespread level, if applicable?
Sanskriti, do you want to go? Or
Sorry, cut out. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. So in regards to the faults with the SDGs, such as the trade-offs, how can we as the youth mitigate these faults and resolve them on a local scale in our region and also a widespread scale?
Okay, so the faults, obviously, they're pretty vast, but essentially what we want you to see is that there's no problem with the SDGs. It's the problem is how we approach it. So I guess it's pretty tough to change what has actually been done. What we can do now is move forward and see how would we do things differently? How would we approach a new framework? How would we implement a new solution? So that is what we want you to see. Personally, I feel like it's very tough to actually change what has already been done. But if you're thinking about new projects, maybe try to sit down and get a team together and analyze, who is this hurting? Like, that's the one question we want you to ask. Instead of saying, who is this going to help? Because that's what every project does. Who is this hurting? Who is this going to hurt? What's the problem going to be if we actually do this? So if you answer those questions and try to maybe not eliminate completely as of now, but if you try to get those factors down, I think that is a very good start to fixing the problem that we've shared with you.
Thank you.
With that, yeah, Daphne, you want to close us out?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having a session and informing us. And thank you all participants for coming. All the important links such as the 24-hour help desk, the feedback form and MUN Impact Fitness campaign link are on the chat. So please make sure to check those out. Also, we have 2 sessions and 1 social hour remaining in our global summit. So please join them as well. Thank you for coming and have a nice day.
Thank you so much, Sanskriti and Sandev, for joining us, for sharing all your knowledge and experience from those days on the executive teams of Doha, to continuing your education and your commitment and curiosity for the SDGs. We really value your opinions and your beliefs, ideas. So thank you for being part of this program. All right.
thank you everyone for coming here today.
We'll be in touch. And with that, it pains me, but I must do it once again. Click the End Meeting for All button. And don't forget the social hour, where yesterday, apparently, the group came up with the idea of having a talent show for MUN Impact. They realized how much talent they all shared, and they want to hear each other. So join the fun today, this afternoon, this evening, whatever it is for you. All right, bye-bye all.